Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and today's episode, I want to follow up a comment from Rob. So Rob left a comment on last week's episode about the Norwegian training protocol. So first of all, thank you, Rob, for your great question and great comment. Loved it. Glad you're enjoying the podcast. And really good to get your thoughts on that. And you put some really good points in there. So I'll read out Rob's comment from last week's podcast. If you haven't listened to that yet, jump on, have a listen, and this one will sort of have some good context for you. But Rob is he's qualified Cert 3 and 4, so qualified personal trainer, and he was saying that he was taught that intervals at 85 to 90% can only be sustained for 3 minutes at a time, and then would need a recovery ratio of sort of 1 to 3 for that work-rest ratio. So if I work for 3 minutes, I would need 9 minutes to recovery before I can do that 3-minute bout again, which is an excellent point. And then he's sort of gone on to say, would it be better to do 4 times 3 minutes with recovery in between that? 9 minutes recovery to allow that to happen. And I think excellent point. I love the critical thinking, Rob, because if you listen to last week's podcast, I would have, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I would have specified that it was around 85 to 90% of your max, or 90 to 95. We'll go through the study in a second, and maintain that for 4 minutes and then 3 minutes rest for this Norwegian protocol. And so Rob's point, 100% valid, and I think it brings around a really, really good discussion about work intensity for cardiovascular training, and how we apply it in the real world, and what's our measure of work rate, intensity, and how we measure it. And I think it really depends on how we're classifying the intervals and the intensity. So what Rob said, I would generally agree with. If you go out and let's say run at 90% of your maximum, let's say VO2, because we're going to talk about VO2 max and heart rate max in a second. But if you're running at 90% of that, or 90% of your maximum, then sustaining that for around 3 minutes is probably the max before you're going to have to reduce your speed, for example, because your body just fatigues. Generally do that. The lactic acid that's going to build up, the muscles get more acidic and they don't work as well. We get that feedback loop, and we have to start, and our body reduces its ability to perform, and we slow down so we can recover. So generally, if we are exercising that sort of intensity, as Rob has said, we're likely going to have to reduce that intensity to recover. So definitely not wrong. And I probably wasn't clear in terms of my explanation of the Norwegian protocol, or it was probably too general, and Rob's sort of done a good job of delving into what I've said from a different point of view, which is really, really cool. In general, the Norwegian protocol, and I've seen it specified a number of different ways, we're generally trying to work for as hard as we can for 4 minutes at an intensity, like generally as hard as we can for 4 minutes is how I would say it. And in the study, so I did post a study in the episode last week, and I'll repost it this week because we're going to delve into it a little bit more. So the study was called, and it was just a study to pull out some research on the Norwegian training protocol, to give you guys a look into when it actually started a fair while ago, and people have been looking at this 4x4 method, or 4 minutes on by 4 minutes recovery, for a period of time, to improve VO2 max and cardiovascular health, for example. The study is called Aerobic High Intensity Intervals Improve VO2 Max More Than Moderate Training. So that's what the study is called, and they looked at a number of different protocols in this study. And I think this is where Rob's point is absolutely valid. And depending on how you explain it, and it can matter a lot with clients, because as you see in this last episode, I've sort of tried to explain the Norwegian protocol, but depending on how someone takes it, they actually don't know how hard to work. And being able to explain this to clients is very, very important. But within the study, I probably briefly mentioned last week that they did a long, slow distance run for 45 minutes. They did a lactic threshold run for about just under 25 minutes. they did 15 on, 15 off, so 15-second intervals. And then they did the 4 times 4-minute intervals to look at improvements in VO2 max after an 8-week training program, basically. So what is interesting is the relationship between heart rate max and VO2 max. And in the study, they talk about, or they basically got the participants to run. It was all running on a treadmill. For some reason, they did the treadmill at a 4.3 incline, 5.3 incline for the treadmill. But they were running at a percent of their max heart rate. So what they sort of specify in the study, and I'll pull some graphics up on the screen if you can watch, but generally they look at heart rate and it can be used as a percentage of the VO2 max. So generally, and what it goes to say is that 70% of a heart rate max is equivalent to about 60% VO2 max. 85% heart rate max is 80% VO2 max, and a 92.5% heart rate max is about 87.5 of your VO2 max. So if I'm working at above 90% of my heart rate max, I'm probably working at only about 87% of my VO2 max potentially. So I've still got that workload in there. So they're different measures of intensity. And that can sometimes be an important factor to where if I'm working at 90% of my VO2 max, that's a higher intensity than 90% of my heart rate max. So that can sometimes be an important thing to understand. If we're reading research and going off just percentages, what is that percentage actually, what is that work intensity meaning? And sometimes that will change based on the modality if I'm, or speed potentially, which I'm running. If I'm on, say, a bike or a treadmill, the interplay may be different. But the interesting thing about these 4 protocols that they did, so the long, slow distance running, the lactic threshold, 15, 15 and 4x4, was that they all had no significant difference between total oxygen uptake. So if I ran each of these different training programs, my oxygen uptake will be the same. So the only thing that's changed is the different intensity I'm working at and the time frame. So whether I'm doing intervals or long distance running, at the end of the session, I've had the same amount of oxygen uptake. So that's a really interesting sort of component of these, how they've tried to standardize the different modalities in terms of output. So back to sort of Rob's point of 85% to 90 for 3 minutes, I would say that probably relates to VO2 max intensity or maximum speed. So if I can, like, how fast can I actually run? And I'm going to run 90% of that. How long can I last at that? Because lactic threshold is a bit different. And if we're talking about heart rate max, for this example in this study, they had the lactate threshold running, which out of all these is probably the least one I want to do. You're sort of running it right at that point that if you go over, you're going to start to accumulate lactic acid and come down. So it's quite a high intensity long distance run, but they were running at 85% of their max heart rate for 25 or for just under 25 minutes. So that's an interesting concept. So that's where I want to start. This is like, it depends on heart rate max and VO2 max as to how long we can potentially sustain based on the percentages. 60% of VO2 max is different to 60% of max heart rate. The other thing that's different, and I think goes to Rob's point, is what he said is like you can't maintain 85 to 90% of your maximum for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, for example. And what they did in this study is they changed the intensity of the work to keep the heart rate in the same zone. So they go on to say, they talk about the different modalities and the heart rate. So when they did, for example, the long, slow distance run or the lactic threshold run, if this heart rate started, so that they're running on a treadmill, if the heart rate started to increase above that zone or above that 85%, they would bring the treadmill speed down. So they'd actually reduce the effort or the work, but the intensity based on heart rate is still the same. So even though I'm still working at an 85% heart rate, my speed has dropped. So if I'm running, let's say 12 kilometers an hour and my heart rate is at 85% of my max and it starts to creep up to 86, 87, I then drop the treadmill down to maybe 10 kilometers an hour, and my heart rate goes back down to that. So by the end of it, my speed on the treadmill could potentially be lower, but I'm running at 80. I'm still running at that higher heart rate based on my fatigue, and how my body is continuing to handle the extended workload. So, as you've said, if I tried to maintain that 12 kilometers per hour for the whole run, there's no way my heart rate is staying at the 85% intensity. But to keep it at the intensity, I've actually dropped the speed at which I'm running. So they did that for the long, slow distance and the lactic threshold group, as well as the interval training. 15-15 was a bit, probably a little bit different based on the such short intervals, but they talk about the 4x4, and the targets were instructed to reach their intensity, which was, let me just double check, was about 90%. It was 90 to 90% of their heart rate max. So they're working a very high intensity in terms of heart rate max. So it's still about 90% of VO2 max, or 87.5% of VO2 max. So it's still just under 9% of VO2 max, potentially around 90, but it would take 1 to 1.5 minutes for me to get to that heart rate within the 4 minutes, and then stay there by adjusting the speed of the treadmill. So the whole idea was to stay that heart rate, even if I had to start reducing the treadmill due to fatigue. So, and I think that's potentially the difference between being able to sustain, say, a certain speed for 3 or 4 minutes versus staying at a heart rate. And you'll find, even though they maintain that heart rate intensity, the work they were doing there dropped. So I think that probably is where that gets crossed over, I think, Rob, in terms of, well, they can't sustain 90% of their VO2 max or 90% of the heart rate for that long, which is probably correct. They can't sustain the intensity that generally they could work at. But due to the fatigue that builds up, we keep that heart rate up there by lowering the intensity. So we, instead of the heart rate going up and jumping above that, and probably fatiguing more, and then we drop off, we start to lower that intensity. So very, very cool. And they have heart rate graphs. So if you have, I'll post a study in the, I'll link the study below as well. So check it out if you want, guys. But they have graphs of different heart rates and how they looked over the training protocols for each of the long, slow distance, lactic threshold, 15-15, and the 4x4. So really interesting. And I think it's how we consider intensity, how we measure that over the long run versus how long we can stay at it. So I can run at 15 kilometers an hour, say, for 3 minutes, and that's going to sort of max me out. But if I sort of slow down that speed towards the end, I'm running at 10, I can keep that heart rate up there, but my speed is actually slower. But as long as I'm keeping the heart rate there, that's what's going to potentially, in this case, lead to the adaptations that I'm after, which is potentially improvements in VO2 max. I think what you said, Rob, in terms of, would it be better to do 4 times 3 minutes with 9 minutes rest in between, because I can maintain that speed? That would be an excellent protocol. For example, if I say wanted to work at my lactic threshold, or work at that high intensity, or get better at that lactic buffering, I would work to maintain that speed, not worrying about the heart rate, but I'll be running at that speed for 3 minutes and trying to maintain that and practice that. So hopefully in future sessions, I can start to, maybe instead of running at 15 kilometers an hour for 3 minutes, I'm going to run at 16 kilometers an hour for 3 minutes. So you can adjust, so you would adjust the outcome, or adjust the measurement and how you sort of would manage that and the intervals based on what outcome you want. If I'm just trying to keep my heart rate in the zone, I don't care about the speed, due to wanting to improve my VO2 max potentially, or follow this protocol, that's how I do it. If I was more tasked with, I had a specific goal of, say, it could be a 5-minute run time, for example, and I was working at, and my goal for the session was to spend as much time at the lactic threshold speed, or at that, say, race speed, that's potentially how you would do it. You would just stick to a speed and then manage your recovery after that. So really, really good point. I think that's how I would differentiate these sessions, based on the goal or potential outcomes you want. And that's a good thing to think about. I think if clients have got a time outcome, you might need to adjust sessions. If it's a health outcome or just a general VO2 max outcome, how can we manipulate what a session looks like? What are we basing the intensity off speed, or are we basing the intensity off heart rate? Are two different variables that may make sessions look slightly different. So, and the end discussion, which we sort of got to a little bit last week, was that the interval training seemed to have or did have better results than the long slow distance and the lactic threshold longer distance runs in improving VO2 max. And when we look at the, like I mentioned at the start, the heart rates, how they related to the VO2 max, the idea is generally that it's the time that we spend at that higher level of VO2 max that is going to help us improve the VO2 max. So while we're sort of running at a relatively high heart rate for the long, slow distance, but definitely the lactic threshold, we're sort of running continuously because the heart, or because we're not reaching that upper levels of VO2 max, we're not at the 85, 90 to 95% of VO2 max, we don't get that stimulus to improve VO2 max. So sessions that allow us to maximize time at 90 to 95% VO2 max, and having our body work at that level, I look to be the best for improving VO2 max. They not want to be the best for improving, say, race speed or lactic threshold, but for VO2 max, according to this study, we generally see those protocols that allow us to spend time at sort of 90 to 95% of max heart rate, which relates to sort of a 90-ish% VO2 max, are going to help us improve that that goal or that outcome for us. So yeah, I hope you got a bit out of that. Rob, great question. Love that thought. Hopefully this gives you my thoughts on it, and how it relates to that information that you sent through, which is absolutely spot on, and how we think about intensity and running and programs and outcomes. There's lots to go into. But really, really good reason to delve into studies and see how they did their protocols, because if like, well, how did they even do that? It's a good thing to delve in and jump in and see what, you can go to the methods section in the studies, and it'll tell you what protocols they did, and try replicate it. Sometimes it's easier said than done. Every client's going to be slightly different. Managing intensity is not always easy if you don't have an accurate heart rate monitor, or you're not on it adjusting speeds, or you're not acclimatized to training. Heart rates are going to be super variable. So it's not going to apply to everyone as specifically it does in the study, which is something to consider too, I think. And yeah, the protocol, as it said in the study, where you train at 90 to 95% of your heart rate max for 4 minutes, with 3 minutes rest and then 4 minutes. It's a relatively tough protocol. It's not easy to get through, and definitely by at the end of that third effort, you're relatively pretty cooked, and that fourth one is just a bit of a grind. Again, you're going to be working at less intensity because of that recovery and how you're managing your heart rate throughout. You're not really working at a true 90% of your max. Your output is going to be less than that, but your heart rate still sticks up there. But yeah, really, really cool concept, guys. Really great podcast. So thanks again, Rob. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your comment. I loved it. I hope you got a bit of this. If you did, feel free to get in touch. Send an email to tom@afa.com.au. If anyone else have any thoughts or ideas or questions, or topics they'd like me to cover, send an email to me as well, tom@afa.com.au. Happy to chat about anything you guys would like to hear me talk about. Other than that, guys, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you all soon.